My sister answered the question before I even realized it was meant for me. We were sitting around the long table, the kind that made every conversation feel official even when it wasn't supposed to be. Papers were spread out. Someone had just finished explaining the next step, then turned slightly in my direction and asked what I thought. I opened my mouth. I actually leaned forward. But my sister spoke first. "She's still processing," she said with a calm smile. "It's a lot for her right now. I think we should move forward the way we discussed." No one stopped her. She didn't sound rushed or aggressive. That was the strange part. Her voice was steady, reassuring, almost helpful, the kind of tone people trusted. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at everyone else, like she was relieving them of a burden. I felt the room relax. Someone nodded. Someone else scribbled a note. The conversation moved on, as if the question had been answered correctly. As if I had answered it myself. I sat there, aware of how quickly the moment had passed. A few seconds earlier, my opinion had been expected. Now it had been replaced, and no one seemed to think that was odd. My sister kept talking, adding context I hadn't given her. She explained my hesitation as overwhelm. She described my silence as agreement. She even slowed her words slightly, the way people do when they think they're being considerate. I watched her do it, part of me still assuming she would stop, that someone would turn back to me and say, "Actually, let her speak." No one did. That was the first time I felt it land in my body, that quiet shift where something fundamental changes. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was just the sudden understanding that the room had decided something about me without checking if it was true. They had decided I was confused. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, that she was just trying to help, that maybe I'd waited too long to respond. I could still fix it, I thought. I could clarify in a minute once there was space. I stayed quiet, watching for the pause that never came. When the conversation finally moved on, I noticed something else. People weren't looking at me anymore. Their eyes kept drifting back to my sister, waiting for her reactions, her cues. She had stepped into a role so smoothly that it felt like she'd always been there. She caught my eye once briefly and smiled. Not a smug smile, a soft one, the kind that says, "Don't worry, I've got this." That was when I understood how dangerous this was going to be. This wasn't just about that one question. The decision on the table wasn't small. It had consequences that would stretch months, maybe years into the future. And yet, my voice had been removed so effortlessly that it barely registered as a loss. When the discussion ended, someone patted my sister's arm and thanked her for explaining things so clearly. I remember that phrase, clearly, as if clarity had been the issue. No one asked me if that explanation matched what I wanted. Later that same day, the pattern repeated itself. A follow-up conversation. A similar setup. A new opportunity for me to speak. This time, I was ready. I didn't hesitate. I didn't overthink it. When the topic came up again, I corrected one small detail. Just one. I kept my voice even, my words simple. I didn't challenge the outcome, only the reasoning. My sister turned toward me immediately. "Oh," she said gently, "see, this is what I mean. She gets stuck on specifics. What she's trying to say is that she's okay with it overall." She repeated my words back to the group, but they weren't my words anymore. She trimmed them, softened them, changed their shape. The point I had made disappeared inside her summary. And again, people nodded, relieved that someone had translated. I felt heat rise in my chest, not anger yet, something closer to panic. I tried again, this time explaining my reasoning, not just the fact. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of anything. I just finished my thought. She didn't let me. She spoke over the last part, still smiling, still calm. "You're overthinking it," she said, not to me but to everyone else. "She's been under a lot of stress. I think what matters is that we move forward." That was when I noticed the shift. The more I explained, the more unstable I sounded. Not because of my words, but because of the way she framed them. Every clarification became proof that I wasn't clear. Every attempt to speak became something she needed to manage. Someone across the table glanced at me, then back at my sister, as if deciding which version of me was easier to deal with. I saw the decision happen in real time. I stopped mid-sentence, not dramatically, I just didn't finish. The silence felt different this time. Heavier. Expectant. For a second I thought someone might ask me to continue. Instead, my sister stepped in smoothly and wrapped things up, speaking as if my unfinished thought had reached a natural conclusion. I realized then that the rules had changed. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a narrative, and I wasn't the one controlling it. Every word I offered gave her more material to reshape. Every correction handed her another opportunity to define me as the problem. I sat back in my chair and listened. As the conversation ended, a strange calm settled over me. Not relief, not acceptance, awareness. I understood that speaking wasn't protecting me. It was feeding something I didn't fully see yet. So I made a choice. I would stop correcting her. Not because I didn't know what was happening, but because I was beginning to understand exactly what was. The silence didn't protect me for long. The next time we spoke, there was a pause in the room that felt almost generous. Someone looked at me, really looked at me, and asked a follow-up question. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't hostile. It was the kind of question meant to invite clarification. I took a breath and answered. I kept it simple. I corrected one small detail from earlier, nothing more. I chose my words carefully, the way you do when you're trying not to sound defensive. I even softened my tone, hoping that would make it easier for everyone to hear me without tension. My sister reacted instantly. "Oh, that's not what she means," she said, smiling again. "She's just getting caught up in the specifics. What she's really saying is that she agrees with the plan." I felt my stomach drop. She didn't argue with me. She didn't contradict me outright. She reframed me. She translated my words into something easier, something less disruptive, something that fit the direction she wanted the conversation to go. And the room accepted it. No one asked me if that translation was accurate. No one asked me to finish my thought. The question that had been directed at me drifted back toward her, as if it had always belonged there. I tried again. This time I explained my reasoning instead of the detail itself. I thought if they understood why I felt the way I did, the confusion would clear up. I spoke slowly, calmly, making sure I didn't interrupt anyone. I was doing everything right. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "She's been overwhelmed lately," she said, still not looking at me. "So sometimes she has trouble expressing what she wants. What she's trying to say is that she trusts us to handle it." The word overwhelmed hung in the air. I felt it land on me like a label. It didn't matter that I hadn't used that word. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. She had said it with such certainty that it became the explanation everyone reached for. I could feel the shift again. The subtle one. The one where people stopped listening for content and started listening for reassurance. And my sister was providing it. I noticed how people relaxed when she spoke, how their shoulders dropped, how the tension eased once she took over. I realized, with a tight ache in my chest, that my voice was making things harder, not clearer for them. That realization hurt more than anything she'd said. I tried one last time to finish my thought. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of misrepresenting me. I simply continued where I'd left off, determined to be heard. She cut in again, just as smoothly. "See?" she said lightly. "This is what I mean. She's thinking in circles." There it was. The sentence was casual, almost affectionate. But it changed everything. It turned my effort to be understood into evidence that I wasn't. I stopped talking. I could feel my face burning, but I kept my expression neutral. I stared down at the papers in front of me, though I wasn't reading them. I was listening. Not just to the words, but to what they were doing. Someone else thanked my sister for clarifying. Someone joked about how confusing these decisions could be. The conversation moved on, and once again, my silence was taken as confirmation. Inside, something shifted. I realized that every time I spoke, she gained more control. My words didn't stand on their own anymore. They passed through her first, came out altered, stripped of their intent. And the more I tried to correct that, the more unstable I appeared. I started to see the pattern. When I explained, she simplified. When I clarified, she reinterpreted. When I insisted, she soothed. Each move made her look more capable and made me look less so. It wasn't aggressive. It was efficient. I watched her closely after that. I noticed how quickly she stepped in whenever there was even a hint of uncertainty. How she answered questions that weren't hers. How she spoke about me in the third person, as if I weren't sitting right there. She doesn't handle stress well. She needs things to be straightforward. She's not great with pressure. Each statement landed softly, wrapped in concern, but they added up to something heavy. A story about me that I hadn't agreed to but couldn't seem to interrupt without proving her point. That was the cruelest part. The room didn't feel hostile. It felt accommodating. People weren't trying to silence me. They just seemed grateful that someone else was making things easier. And in that context, my insistence on speaking started to feel selfish, even disruptive. I felt the urge to apologize, though I wasn't sure for what. That was when I understood that clarity wasn't the goal anymore. Control was. And control didn't require truth, just consistency. So I tested something. The next time a question came up that clearly involved me, I didn't answer right away. I waited. Just a beat longer than usual. Long enough to feel uncomfortable. My sister stepped in immediately. "She's fine with it," she said without hesitation. "We talked about it." We hadn't. But no one questioned her. No one turned to me for confirmation. The pause I'd left was filled so quickly that it barely registered as absence. I felt a strange sense of relief. Not because I agreed with what she'd said, but because I finally saw the rules clearly. Speaking wasn't how I would regain control. It was how I was losing it. The more I explained, the more material she had to work with. The more I defended myself, the more she positioned herself as my interpreter. So I stopped. I didn't argue. I didn't object. I didn't correct her when she spoke for me again. I sat there, listening, storing every word, every assumption, every moment where my silence was used to close a conversation. For the first time since this started, I wasn't trying to fix the misunderstanding. I was trying to understand it. I thought the tension might reset once we were no longer in the same room. Different day, different setting, different people. That's what I told myself. I assumed whatever had been happening was situational, tied to the pressure of decisions and timing. Away from that table, away from that moment, things would return to normal. They didn't. I was standing in the hallway when I heard my sister's voice from around the corner. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't hiding. She was explaining something to someone else, the same calm, confident tone she always used when she believed she was being helpful. "She's just not in a great headspace right now," my sister said. "It's easier if I handle the details for her." I froze. I hadn't announced myself. I hadn't interrupted. I stayed where I was, listening, my heart thudding in my ears as she continued speaking about me as if I weren't there at all. "She gets overwhelmed when there are too many options," she went on. "So we've been simplifying things. It's better this way." Better for who? I wondered. She talked about my preferences, my comfort level, my limits. None of it was accurate. It was neat and tidy, stripped of hesitation or nuance, shaped into something that made her sound capable and me sound fragile. And the worst part was how natural it sounded, like this was a role she'd rehearsed. The person she was talking to murmured sympathetically. I could hear it in their voice. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? She spoke with certainty, with concern. She sounded like someone protecting someone else. I felt something tighten in my chest, sharp and cold. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't her stepping in once or twice to smooth things over. This was a version of me she had created and was now presenting to the world without hesitation. I waited for her to say something that hinted at uncertainty. A pause, a question, anything that suggested she might check with me before continuing. She didn't. She finished her explanation, thanked the person for understanding, and moved on as if the matter were settled. I stood there long enough to hear her footsteps retreat before I finally moved, my legs unsteady, my thoughts racing. For a moment, a memory surfaced, uninvited. I remembered a time when someone had asked me directly what I wanted. I remembered the quiet that followed, the space I'd been given to think, to answer without interruption. I remembered how it felt to be trusted with my own voice. The contrast hit me harder than anything she'd said. Back in the present, I replayed her words over and over in my head. Not the content, but the structure, the confidence, the way she framed her assumptions as facts. I realized I'd heard versions of that same explanation before, not just once, not just twice. It was always the same phrases, the same concern-laced conclusions, the same calm authority. She had a script, and I had been feeding it. Every time I spoke up, every time I tried to clarify, she adjusted the script slightly, refined it, made it sound more convincing. My objections didn't weaken her story. They strengthened it by giving her something to respond to. I understood that now. Later that day, we crossed paths again. She didn't mention what I'd overheard. She smiled at me, asked if I was okay, the question casual enough to sound sincere. I nodded. I didn't challenge her. I didn't bring it up. She relaxed immediately. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't worried about my understanding. She was worried about my resistance. And the moment I stopped pushing back, she felt safe enough to continue. As the days went on, I watched her more closely. I paid attention to when she spoke for me and when she didn't. I noticed how she stepped in faster when decisions carried weight, how she softened her voice when she sensed doubt in the room. She wasn't improvising, she was managing. I felt anger rise, sharp and insistent, but I kept it contained. I knew now that confronting her directly would only reinforce the image she was projecting. I would become emotional, defensive, difficult, exactly who she'd been describing. So I did something that surprised even me. I stopped reacting. I didn't correct her when she summarized my thoughts inaccurately. I didn't interrupt when she answered questions meant for me. I didn't argue when she made assumptions out loud. I listened. The more I listened, the more she revealed. Without interruption, her explanations grew bolder. She stopped qualifying her statements. She spoke as if her authority were unquestioned, and no one questioned it. That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't about helping me navigate something complicated. This was about controlling the narrative before I had a chance to shape it myself. One afternoon, she caught me watching her. Our eyes met across the room, and for a split second something flickered across her face. Not guilt, not concern, confidence. She assumed I didn't understand what she was doing. That assumption settled into place quietly, like a door clicking shut. And in that instant, I made a decision that felt strange, but right. I wouldn't interrupt anymore. Not because I was giving up, not because I was confused, but because every word she spoke without challenge showed me exactly how far she was willing to go. And I wanted to see all of it. The first time I chose not to respond, it felt unnatural. The pause opened in front of me like an invitation I refused to accept. A familiar question landed on the table, one that usually would have pulled me into the conversation. I felt the instinct to speak rise in my chest, quick and automatic, and then I held it there. I said nothing. The silence stretched for half a second longer than anyone expected. Long enough to feel awkward, long enough to draw attention. I watched faces shift, waiting for me to fill the gap. My sister didn't. She stepped in immediately, as if she'd been standing just behind the moment, ready to claim it. "She's okay with it," she said. "We talked about it earlier." We hadn't. But no one questioned her. The relief was almost visible. The conversation moved forward smoothly, efficiently, without the friction my voice seemed to create. The decision was recorded, the next topic introduced, and just like that, my silence was absorbed into the process. Something inside me settled. Not relief. Recognition. This was what happened when I didn't interfere. This was how quickly she took over when the space was left open. I sat back and observed the shift, the way a new pattern formed almost instantly. From that moment on, it accelerated. I stopped responding in small ways at first. I didn't correct details, I didn't add clarifications. I let assumptions pass without comment. Each time, my sister filled the space more confidently than before. She prefers it this way. She doesn't need to be involved in every detail. She trusts me to handle it. Each sentence was delivered calmly, without apology, as if it were an established fact. And with every repetition, it became one. People stopped waiting for me altogether. They turned toward her when questions arose. They asked for her input before looking in my direction. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The room had adapted to a new structure, one where my presence was optional. I noticed how comfortable everyone became with that arrangement. My sister stopped checking with me entirely. She didn't glance my way for confirmation. She didn't hesitate before answering on my behalf. She spoke as if my agreement were guaranteed, as if my silence had signed off on every decision. And in a way, it had. Not because I agreed, but because no one needed to hear my consent anymore. The absence of resistance was enough. The scope of her control widened quickly. What started as explanations turned into decisions. What had once been framed as help became authority. She discussed timelines, commitments, long-term plans, all in my name. Each time, I felt the familiar urge to step in, to correct the record, to reclaim my place. And each time, I stopped myself. I was learning something important. The room responded better to certainty than truth. And my sister provided certainty effortlessly. She gave people a version of events that was neat, decisive, and easy to work with. My hesitation, my nuance, my need to be accurate disrupted that. So I watched. I watched how people adjusted their expectations. How they began to refer back to her statements as if they were mine. How they spoke about me in past tense, even while I was sitting right there. She didn't object. She seemed comfortable with it. She understands. I understood more than they realized. There was a cost to this role I'd been assigned. Being easy to manage meant being invisible. It meant that when something didn't sit right with me, there was no natural way to express it without seeming difficult. Resistance would have stood out sharply now, like a sudden noise in a quiet room. That was the trap. If I spoke up, I would confirm everything she'd been implying. That I was inconsistent, emotional, unclear. The story had already been written, and any deviation from it would look like proof. So I stayed quiet. The more I withdrew, the bolder she became. She stopped softening her language. She stopped couching her decisions in concern. She spoke with authority, with finality, as if the matter were settled the moment she opened her mouth. I noticed something else, too. She made mistakes, small ones at first, a date slightly off, a condition simplified beyond recognition, details that didn't quite line up with what had been discussed previously. They slipped through because no one was correcting her, including me. Every instinct told me to intervene, to fix it before it became a problem. But I resisted, forcing myself to stay still, to let the process reveal itself. The room trusted her enough not to question these things, and that trust made her careless. One afternoon, a particularly significant decision was made in my name. It wasn't framed as tentative or open to revision. It was stated as fact, documented, and acknowledged by everyone present. No one looked at me, not for confirmation, not for objection, not even out of courtesy. I felt the weight of that moment settle over me, heavy and unmistakable. This silence was no longer neutral. It was shaping outcomes. It was closing doors. And yet, I didn't break it. Because I could see where this was going. She believed she had total control now. She believed my silence meant surrender, confusion, acceptance. She believed the narrative was complete. What she didn't realize was that by stepping fully into my place, she had removed the last layer of protection she'd had. Every word she spoke now carried more risk. Every assumption she made was no longer checked against reality. I sat there, hands folded, expression calm, listening closely as another decision was finalized without me. This wasn't about being unheard anymore. It was about watching someone reveal exactly how much they were willing to decide for me, and how far they would go once they thought I was no longer paying attention. And I was paying attention to everything. By the time everyone stopped noticing my silence, I had already learned how to use it. The conversations kept happening without me. That became the new normal. Decisions were discussed, refined, and finalized while I sat there, present but unaddressed, like a piece of furniture no one needed to move around anymore. At first, that invisibility stung. Then it sharpened me. I stopped waiting for a chance to speak and started listening with intention. I paid attention to who spoke first and who echoed them. I noticed how quickly my sister's words were repeated by others, sometimes verbatim, sometimes slightly polished. I watched who nodded before she even finished a sentence. I saw who avoided looking at me altogether, as if eye contact might complicate things. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped reacting. My sister used the same phrases again and again. She framed uncertainty as inconvenience. She replaced my silence with assumed agreement. She leaned heavily on words like we and already, as if consensus had been reached long before the conversation began. We already talked about this. We're all on the same page. She didn't raise any concerns. Each phrase closed a door. What changed next wasn't her tone, it was the scale. The decisions grew heavier. They weren't just about logistics or preferences anymore. They involved commitments that couldn't be easily undone. Timelines were set, responsibilities assigned, outcomes locked in. And every time she spoke for me. I watched a decision unfold that directly affected my future, one that should have required my explicit approval. My sister didn't hesitate. She summarized my position confidently, reducing a complex reality to a simple yes. No one questioned it. That was when I understood how far this had gone. This wasn't about smoothing over awkward moments or keeping things efficient. This was control, exercised quietly, wrapped in the language of helpfulness. I felt a familiar surge of urgency rise in me, the instinct to interrupt, to correct the record before it solidified. My mouth opened slightly, then closed again. I didn't speak. Instead, I noted the exact wording she used. I memorized the order of events as she described them. I paid attention to who was present, who heard what, who nodded in agreement, because something didn't line up. It was small at first, a detail about timing that contradicted an earlier conversation. A condition that had never been discussed suddenly presented as settled, a justification that shifted depending on who was listening. I didn't react outwardly, I logged it. The more I stayed quiet, the more comfortable she became. Without interruption, her explanations grew smoother and faster. She stopped qualifying her statements. She stopped checking herself. Certainty replaced accuracy. I could see it happening in real time. She spoke as if nothing could challenge her version anymore. And why would it? The person most affected by these decisions wasn't saying a word. People trusted her. They trusted the consistency of her story, not realizing it was being adjusted on the fly. At one point, someone asked a question that brushed dangerously close to the inconsistency I'd noticed. My sister answered without missing a beat, offering a response that contradicted what she'd said earlier. No one caught it. I did. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not fear, resolve. If I had corrected her back when this started, that contradiction would never have surfaced. My silence had allowed it to exist. And now it was out there, floating between conversations, unchallenged but real. I understood then that silence wasn't just shielding me, it was exposing her. I began to listen differently after that, not just to what she said, but to how often she repeated herself, how she adjusted details depending on the audience, how her confidence grew in proportion to the lack of resistance. She was building something unstable. Another decision was finalized soon after, based entirely on her summary of my position. I recognized immediately that it conflicted with something she'd said earlier, but I let it pass. I watched as it was documented, acknowledged, and accepted. The room moved on. Inside, I felt a strange calm. For the first time, I wasn't hoping someone would notice the problem. I knew it was there. I knew it would matter later. And I knew that speaking now would only collapse everything into noise. So I stayed quiet. I stopped thinking of my silence as something that needed to be explained. It was no longer an absence, it was a position. One that allowed me to see the full shape of what was happening without being pulled into it. My sister continued to speak freely, unaware that every unchecked assumption was stacking up. Every inconsistency was becoming part of a pattern. Every confident statement was narrowing her options. She believed my silence meant safety. What it really meant was time. By the end of that week, I had a clear mental map of her narrative. I knew where it bent and where it broke. I knew which details were solid and which ones shifted depending on convenience. And I knew something else, too. The truth didn't need my voice to exist. It was already forming, quietly, in the spaces she thought no one was paying attention to. I heard the story twice in the same day, and that was when I knew it wasn't stable. The first version came early, told to someone who hadn't been present before. My sister explained everything with the same practiced calm I'd grown used to. She spoke in complete sentences, confident transitions, no pauses. It sounded polished, almost professional. I stood a few steps away, close enough to hear every word. She described a recent decision as mutual. She said we had discussed it thoroughly, that I had understood the implications, that I'd agreed it was the best course of action. She framed it as something that had taken time and care. None of that was true. Not entirely false either, just edited. Later that afternoon I heard her tell the story again. This time the audience was different, more familiar. The tone shifted slightly. She moved faster, skipped steps. Details that had been emphasized earlier were now absent. She still said we had talked, but she no longer mentioned hesitation. Agreement replaced consideration. I felt a quiet click in my mind. 2 versions. Same event, different shape. I began replaying them side by side, comparing the language. The first had been padded with concern, designed to reassure. The second was efficient, designed to conclude. In both, my silence had been translated into consent. She was fine with it. She didn't object. She trusted me to decide. Those phrases appeared in both versions, identical, as if they'd been memorized. They functioned like seals, closing the conversation before anyone could question it. What was missing mattered more. There was no mention of the condition I had raised early on, no reference to the uncertainty that had existed before my voice was removed, no acknowledgement of the fact that the decision had been finalized without my input. The gaps were clean, intentional. I stayed quiet and watched how easily people accepted the edited version. They didn't ask follow-up questions. They didn't look for confirmation. They nodded and moved on, grateful for clarity. Authority travels fast when no one slows it down. I noticed something else that day. People had started quoting my sister when referring to my position. They didn't say, "She said." They said, "Your sister mentioned," or "We were told." My thoughts no longer belonged to me. Her version had become the reference point, the default, the thing others checked against. And with each retelling, her confidence grew. She stopped softening her statements. She spoke in absolutes, as if uncertainty had never existed. She stopped framing decisions as collaborative and started presenting them as resolved. No one challenged her. Until one detail slipped. It was small, almost invisible. A timing issue. She placed an event before something else that couldn't have happened yet. Anyone skimming would have missed it. Anyone not paying attention would have let it pass. I didn't. The inconsistency sat there, quiet and uncorrected. I watched her move past it, watched others follow. Later, someone asked a casual question that brushed against it. Not directly, just close enough to test the surface. My sister answered too quickly. She corrected herself, but not entirely. The adjustment created a second inconsistency, one that contradicted her earlier explanation to the first audience. It was subtle, but it was there. I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. This was what happened when no one interrupted her. Without resistance, she filled every gap, even the ones she shouldn't have. Her confidence, once precise, was becoming careless. She believed she was speaking into a vacuum. I remained silent. As the day went on, she repeated the incorrect detail again, this time in a group setting. More people heard it. More people accepted it. It was stated as fact, without hesitation or qualification. I noticed a brief pause afterward, a flicker of uncertainty in someone's expression. It passed quickly, smoothed over by her certainty. But it existed. I could feel the narrative stretching, pulled too tight in places. The more she committed to her version, the less room there was to adjust it later. She didn't see that. She spoke freely, unaware that every repetition narrowed her options. That every unchallenged assumption was being recorded, not just in documents but in memory. I didn't correct her. I didn't step in to save the story from itself. I let it stand exactly as she presented it. That was the hardest part. There was a time when I would have rushed to fix the mistake, to protect the outcome, to keep things from unraveling. But I understood now that intervening would only reset the pattern. It would give her a chance to reframe, to smooth over the cracks. Silence was doing something different. It was letting the inconsistencies exist long enough to be noticed by others. By the end of the day, I had heard at least 3 variations of the same story, each one confident. Each one slightly different, each one depending on the assumption that no one would compare notes. She avoided looking at me when she spoke, not out of guilt, out of certainty. She assumed I wasn't following, that I didn't understand the implications of what she was saying. That assumption made her comfortable, and comfort made her careless. As the conversation wound down, someone mentioned that the details might need to be reviewed later, just to be sure. My sister agreed quickly, waving it off as a formality. I said nothing. Inside, I felt steady. I now had something solid. Not proof yet, but shape. The story she was telling couldn't hold if it was examined closely. It depended on silence remaining passive. It wasn't. I stayed where I was, listening, as she finished another explanation that didn't quite match the last one. I had 2 versions now, and they couldn't both survive. I could feel the shift before anyone said a word. The conversation picked up where it had left off, but the energy was different now, not tense, not confrontational, just cautious. My sister spoke first, as she always did, but there was a new sharpness in her voice. Less explanation, more declaration. "She's already agreed," she said firmly, "so we can move forward." No pause, no glance in my direction. That certainty would have comforted everyone a week earlier. Now it landed heavier. I noticed it in the way one person leaned back instead of nodding, in the way another hesitated before writing anything down. My sister didn't notice. She had stopped checking her footing. As the discussion continued, she made another absolute statement, one that rested on a detail I knew was wrong, not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. A date that didn't line up, a condition that had never been finalized. It would have been easy to correct her, almost instinctive. The words formed in my mind, ready to step in and smooth it over. I stayed quiet. The silence pressed against her statement like a weight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone asked a question, not challenging, just curious. "Oh, right," my sister said quickly. "That was handled earlier." She answered too fast. She didn't slow down to think. She didn't verify the detail. She pushed through, confident that no one would dig deeper. That was the first real crack. I saw it in the way one person frowned, just briefly, in the way another tilted their head, as if something hadn't settled properly. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. My sister continued, unaware that the ground had shifted beneath her. She repeated the incorrect detail again a few minutes later, this time to a wider group. This wasn't a private explanation anymore. It was public, recorded, treated as fact. I watched the room absorb it, and I watched how easily it could be traced back to her. Her confidence had become a liability. She spoke as if the outcome were inevitable, as if every path led exactly where she wanted it to go. She stopped cushioning her words with concern. She didn't say, "I think," or "we discussed." She said, "This is how it is." That tone didn't invite collaboration. It demanded acceptance, and for the first time, it didn't fully work. Someone glanced at me. Just a flicker, not long enough to be obvious, long enough to register. It wasn't a request for clarification. It was uncertainty. I didn't respond. The silence stretched, subtle but noticeable. My sister filled it immediately, offering another explanation, then another. Each one sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they didn't align. She was talking more now, not less, expanding, adding context no one had asked for. Trying to reinforce what she sensed was weakening. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't about catching her in a lie. It was about watching her overcommit to a version of events that couldn't withstand scrutiny. The more she spoke, the more fixed her position became, the less room she left herself to adjust later. I thought back to how carefully she'd managed her words at the beginning, how she'd softened every statement, framed every assumption as concern. That caution was gone. She believed the room was still hers. She didn't realize that authority only works when it's invisible. The moment it has to assert itself, it starts to fray. Another question came up, this one brushing directly against the inconsistency. My sister answered without hesitation, but her response contradicted something she'd said earlier in the same conversation. I saw it land. This time, someone else noticed. Not openly. Not yet. But the pause afterward lasted a beat longer than usual. The silence felt different now. Not empty. Expectant. My sister smiled and moved on, unaware of what she'd just done. I stayed still. I could have ended it there. One sentence from me would have clarified everything. I could have corrected the detail, reset the narrative, spared everyone the discomfort. But that would have protected her. And I wasn't here to protect her anymore. I watched as the conversation continued, as she referenced the same incorrect detail again, more firmly this time, as if repetition would make it solid. Each time she said it, the story hardened. Each time it became more difficult to reconcile with reality. That was the cost of confidence without verification. By the end of the discussion, the room felt unsettled. Not enough to stop anything outright. Enough to slow it down. Enough to introduce doubt. As people gathered their things, I noticed something new. Someone hesitated near me, then thought better of it. Someone else looked between me and my sister, as if recalibrating. My sister didn't notice any of it. She walked out ahead of everyone, posture relaxed, convinced she'd closed the matter cleanly, convinced my silence meant compliance, confusion, or defeat. She had no idea that her certainty had just become the strongest evidence against her. I remained where I was for a moment longer, letting the room empty. The quiet felt different now. Not isolating, powerful. This wasn't about exposing her yet. It was about letting her speak freely enough that the truth could surface on its own. And it was surfacing, one uncorrected statement at a time. I followed them out a moment later, calm, composed, unreadable. Her confidence was no longer armor. It was a trail. The document appeared in the middle of the conversation like an afterthought. Someone slid it across the table, casual, almost bored, as if it were just another formality. My sister didn't pause. She kept talking, her voice steady, confident, already shaping the narrative before anyone had time to read. I recognized it immediately. Not because I'd seen that exact page before, but because I knew what it represented. It wasn't an opinion or a summary, it was a record. Dates, notes, decisions written down in ink that didn't bend easily. My sister spoke over it. She referenced the same conclusions she'd been repeating for weeks, her words flowing smoothly, as if the paper in front of us existed only to confirm what she'd already said. I watched her hands move as she gestured, confident, unbothered. I stayed quiet. The first discrepancy was small, a line near the top that contradicted one of her most repeated claims. It wasn't obvious unless you were looking closely. I saw it instantly. I said nothing. I watched as the paper was passed around. Some skimmed, some read carefully. My sister continued to explain, her voice filling the space, guiding interpretation before questions could form. The record didn't match her version. Not completely. Someone paused longer than expected, eyes lingering on a paragraph. They didn't say anything, but the rhythm of the room slowed. The easy nods stopped. The air shifted. I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction. Confirmation. For a brief moment, a memory surfaced. I remembered being cut off mid-sentence weeks earlier, my sister finishing my thought for me. Incorrectly, confidently. I remembered the sound of her voice overlapping mine, the way the room had accepted her version without hesitation. The contrast was sharp. Back in the present, the paper didn't interrupt her the way I had been. It didn't apologize for existing. It didn't soften its tone. It just sat there, quietly contradicting her. She kept talking. She referenced the timeline again, repeating the detail she'd committed to earlier. This time, it landed directly against the written record. The mismatch was clearer now, harder to ignore. Someone cleared their throat. "I thought this happened later," they said, not accusing, just confused. My sister smiled. "Right, but we adjusted things afterward." Adjusted wasn't the word used in the document. I watched her eyes flick down for half a second, then back up. She spoke a little more slowly now. Her certainty wavered, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. People began rereading. Questions changed shape. They weren't confirmations anymore. They were clarifications. Small, careful, pointed. The record was no longer a formality. It was a problem. I stayed silent, my hands folded, my expression neutral. This wasn't the moment to speak. This was the moment to let the contrast do its work. Then the second inconsistency surfaced. It was bigger. A condition that had been stated repeatedly as settled was clearly marked as pending. Not ambiguous. Pending. In plain language. This time someone said something. Not directly, not confrontationally, just enough to bring it into the open. My sister hesitated. It was the first real hesitation I'd seen from her. She laughed lightly, waved it off, said it must not have been updated yet. She spoke quickly, too quickly, offering an explanation that didn't quite connect to what was written. The room didn't move on. People looked between the page and her face. Someone asked when the update had been made. Someone else asked who had authorized the change. My sister answered, but her voice had lost its effortless rhythm. She filled space with words instead of clarity. I realized something then. Up until this point, my silence had been easy to dismiss. It could be explained away as confusion, withdrawal, passivity. But the record didn't have that problem. It didn't need to be interpreted through anyone else's voice. It simply existed. The paper was set aside for further review. That phrase landed like a bell tolling. Not dramatic, final. My sister didn't look at me. She avoided my eyes as the conversation wrapped up, as if instinct told her something had shifted and she didn't want to see it confirmed. Inside, I felt steady. This wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge yet. It was alignment. The truth had entered the room, and it hadn't needed me to carry it. As people stood and gathered their things, I noticed something subtle. The way questions were no longer directed automatically at my sister. The way conversations slowed, decisions deferred. Silence had changed meaning. It was no longer read as confusion. It was read as restraint, as intention. My sister gathered her papers quickly, her movements sharper than usual. She thanked everyone, tried to sound normal, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried for weeks. I stayed where I was, letting the room empty. The record lay on the table, untouched now, waiting. I understood then that I didn't need to correct the story. I didn't need to argue my way back into the narrative. The inconsistencies were already there, visible to anyone willing to look. And now someone was looking. I picked up my bag and left quietly, just as I always had. But this time, the silence followed me differently. It wasn't trailing behind me anymore. It was standing where I'd been, undeniable, holding the truth in plain sight. The next meeting didn't begin the way the others had. No one rushed to speak. Chairs scraped softly as people settled in, papers were aligned more carefully than before, and the air felt heavier, like everyone had agreed, without saying it, that assumptions were no longer safe. For the first time in weeks, someone looked at me before opening their mouth. It wasn't a dramatic look, just a brief glance checking where I was, as if my presence suddenly mattered again. I didn't respond. I kept my expression neutral and waited. My sister noticed it too. She spoke a fraction later than usual, as though recalibrating. Her voice was still confident, but it had lost that effortless flow. The certainty now sounded rehearsed, not natural. "So, as we discussed," she began, then paused. "Well, based on what we covered last time." She adjusted mid-sentence. I heard it clearly. Questions came slower now. They weren't framed as confirmations anymore. They were careful, precise, designed to avoid stepping on unstable ground. My sister answered them, but she added qualifiers she'd never needed before. "I believe," as far as I remember. The understanding was. Each one chipped away at the image she'd built. Someone referenced the record from before, not confrontationally, casually, as if it were now part of the shared landscape. My sister nodded quickly, too quickly, and agreed it should be kept in mind. Kept in mind. I stayed quiet, watching the shift ripple outward. The strangest part was how my silence started to feel different to everyone else. It wasn't dismissed anymore, it was noted. People waded through it instead of stepping over it. At one point, someone said, "She hasn't said anything yet," gesturing toward me, not confused, not overwhelmed, yet. The word hung there, open. My sister glanced at me then, just briefly. Her eyes searched my face, not for understanding but for reaction. She didn't find one. She cleared her throat and continued, but the rhythm was off. She circled back to earlier points, repeating herself as if consistency alone could rebuild certainty. The repetition didn't land the way it used to. The room was listening differently now. I could feel it in the pauses after her answers, in the way people took notes more carefully, in the way they stopped nodding automatically. Silence had become uncomfortable, but not for me. I realized something then. Being unreadable was powerful. When I spoke, she shaped my words. When I stayed silent, she had nothing to work with, no tone to reinterpret, no emotion to frame. The uncertainty shifted to her. She started over-explaining, filling space that didn't need to be filled, adding context no one asked for. The more she talked, the more she revealed how much she needed control back. That need showed. Someone asked a direct question about my position. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't leading, just direct. The room waited. I didn't answer, not immediately. The pause stretched longer than before. This time, no one rushed to fill it. My sister didn't jump in. She hesitated, visibly torn between speaking for me and risking further scrutiny. That hesitation spoke louder than anything I could have said. I watched it register across the table, the subtle exchange of looks, the recalculation. I finally spoke then, not to answer the question but to acknowledge it. "I'm listening," I said calmly. That was all. The effect was immediate, no defensiveness, no confusion, just clarity. I wasn't absent. I wasn't lost. I was choosing when to engage. My sister stiffened. The conversation continued, but the balance had shifted. Decisions were no longer declared. They were proposed. Follow-ups were suggested instead of conclusions drawn. My sister adapted, trying to regain footing, but the ease was gone. Every word now carried weight. By the end of the meeting, nothing was finalized. That alone would have been unthinkable a week earlier. As people stood to leave, someone lingered near me, hesitated, then said quietly, "We'll circle back after reviewing everything." Everything. I nodded, met their eyes, and said nothing more. My sister gathered her things quickly, avoiding my gaze. The confidence she'd worn so easily had cracked, replaced by something tighter, more guarded. For the first time, she looked unsure, not of the facts, but of me. And that told me everything. Silence had stopped being a shield. It had become leverage. Not because I'd withheld information, but because I'd refused to perform confusion for her benefit. I had let the room see the difference between absence and restraint. As I walked out, I felt no rush to explain myself, no urge to reclaim anything. The pace had changed, and now everyone was moving at my speed. No one knew how to move the conversation forward. The room felt stalled, like a car stuck in neutral. Papers were laid out, pens ready, but no one reached for them. The usual momentum was gone. Where my sister's voice once carried things effortlessly from point to point, there was now hesitation. She waited a beat longer than usual before speaking. "Well," she said carefully, "based on everything we've already discussed." Her sentence trailed off slightly, as if she were testing the ground before committing her weight. That alone would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. She used to speak as though the floor beneath her feet was solid. Someone shifted in their chair. Then a voice cut through the quiet. Calm, neutral, not challenging. "Can I ask something?" It wasn't directed at me. It wasn't directed at my sister either. It came from the middle of the table, the kind of person people trusted because they didn't speak often and didn't exaggerate when they did. My sister nodded immediately. Of course. The question was simple, almost mundane. It focused on one specific detail my sister had repeated several times as fact: a date, a sequence, something that either had a clear source or didn't. "Where is that confirmed?" the person asked. "Is it in the record?" The air tightened. My sister answered too fast. "Yes," she said. "That was already agreed upon. She was aware of it." She gestured vaguely in my direction, not quite pointing, not quite looking at me. I didn't move. Her answer sounded confident, but it skipped something important. It explained around the question instead of answering it. She referenced understanding, not documentation. Agreement, not evidence. The person who had asked the question nodded slowly, then tilted their head. "Right," they said. "But where does it say that?" That was it. Not an accusation, not a confrontation, just a follow-up. I felt the shift ripple across the table. My sister hesitated. A real hesitation this time. Her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced down at the papers, flipped one page, then another. She started speaking again, slower now, her words layered with explanation. "Well, it was discussed verbally," she said. "And at the time, there wasn't any objection, so it's not written," the person said gently. Silence landed hard. I watched my sister's posture change, just slightly. Her shoulders stiffened. She nodded a little too quickly. "It just hasn't been updated yet," she said. "That's all." The follow-up came immediately. "When was the update supposed to happen?" This time, she didn't answer right away. The pause stretched, long enough to feel, long enough for people to exchange looks, long enough for the room to realize something was off. I stayed still. Someone turned toward me. Not with expectation, but curiosity, the kind that comes when a story no longer holds on its own. I didn't speak. The person asking the questions didn't press further. They simply said, "Okay," and made a note. That single motion did more damage than any argument could have. From that moment on, my sister wasn't leading anymore. She was responding. Each new question nudged her into explanation mode, forcing her to account for things she'd previously declared as settled. She tried to recover by broadening the conversation, bringing it back to intent, to overall goals, to what she framed as the bigger picture. But the tone had changed. People weren't accepting summaries anymore. They wanted specifics, details, sources. I watched her carefully. The more she spoke, the more precise she became, as if tightening her language might restore authority. But precision only highlighted the gaps she'd been glossing over. At one point, someone said, "Maybe we should review the record again." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't said with frustration. It was practical. My sister nodded. "Sure, that makes sense." She didn't argue. She couldn't. The conversation slowed to a crawl after that. Decisions were deferred. Timelines softened. What had once been presented as final was now provisional. All without me saying a word. Near the end, the same person who had asked the first question looked at me directly. "Do you want to add anything?" they asked. The room went quiet. This silence felt different from all the others. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't impatient. It was open. I met their gaze and held it. "Not right now," I said calmly. No explanation, no clarification, just truth. I saw something flicker across my sister's face then. Recognition, not of guilt, but of miscalculation. She had assumed my silence meant I didn't understand what was happening. She had built everything on that assumption. And now, the room knew better. As people gathered their things, conversations broke off into smaller, quieter exchanges. The energy was subdued, thoughtful. No one rushed out. No one joked. My sister packed her papers slowly, carefully, avoiding my eyes. The confidence she once carried so easily had thinned into something brittle. I stood and left without fanfare. In the hallway, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not because I'd won anything, but because the truth no longer needed defending. It had been allowed to stand on its own. One question had done what hours of explaining never could, and it hadn't been asked by me. The room didn't return to normal after that. It couldn't. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if no one said it out loud. Conversations resumed, but cautiously, like people walking across ice they no longer trusted. The easy confidence that had once guided everything was gone. My sister tried to speak first again. She adjusted her tone, softened it, leaned into concern. "I just want to make sure we're all comfortable," she said. "My intention was always to help." Intention, not accuracy. She framed her earlier certainty as misunderstanding, her control as protection. She spoke about how hard things had been, how stressful the situation was, how she'd only stepped in because she thought I needed it. No one interrupted her, but no one followed her either. The room listened politely, then waited. The silence that followed her explanation wasn't the kind that rushed to be filled. It sat there, heavy and deliberate, as if everyone was weighing her words instead of absorbing them. Questions came, but they weren't directed at her this time. Someone asked about process. Someone else asked about documentation. The conversation drifted away from her framing and toward verifiable details. Her words no longer closed the discussion. They opened it. I watched her notice. Her posture changed, subtle but telling. She leaned forward more. She watched faces closely. She tried to anticipate questions before they were asked, but her timing was off now. She wasn't guiding the room anymore. She was reacting to it. At one point, she glanced at me, her eyes searching for something. Agreement, confusion, resistance, anything she could use. I gave her nothing. The realization began to form slowly, not as a single moment, but as a series of small recognitions. The kind that creep in when a narrative collapses quietly instead of dramatically. Someone said, "It seems like she chose not to engage," gesturing toward me. Not confused, not overwhelmed, chose. The word landed with weight. My sister froze for half a second. It was barely noticeable, but I saw it. The shift from explaining to understanding, from confidence to calculation. She looked at me differently then, not as someone she needed to manage, but as someone she hadn't accounted for. I felt something settle inside me, a calm that didn't need to prove itself. The conversation continued without urgency. Decisions were postponed, follow-ups scheduled. The sense of inevitability my sister had cultivated was gone, replaced by deliberation. For the first time, nothing moved unless everyone agreed. That was the real consequence. Later, when the group began to disperse, my sister lingered near the table. She gathered her things slowly, methodically, as if stalling might give her time to regain control. She didn't speak to me right away. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't realize," she said. She stopped there. Didn't realize what? That I understood? That I was paying attention? That her silence filling had been mistaken for authority? She didn't finish the thought. I looked at her, not unkindly, not triumphantly, just honestly. "You never asked," I said. That was all. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of everything that had happened without dragging it into the open. Her face changed then. Not dramatically. Just enough to show recognition. The kind that arrives too late to change the outcome. She nodded once, a small movement, and looked away. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. For weeks she had assumed my silence meant confusion, that I was lost, overwhelmed, incapable of keeping up. She had built her control on that assumption, reinforced it with repetition, protected it with confidence. She had never considered the alternative, that I was choosing when to speak, that I was listening, that I understood exactly what was happening and had decided not to participate in it. The meeting ended without resolution, but something more important had resolved itself. The story she'd been telling about me no longer held. Not because I'd argued against it, but because it couldn't survive scrutiny. As I walked out, I realized I didn't feel the need to explain anything further. The room had already learned what it needed to know. Silence wasn't evidence of misunderstanding. It was evidence of restraint. And once that was understood, nothing she said could put things back the way they were. The realization had landed, quietly, too late. The room was waiting for me, and for the first time it didn't feel hostile or impatient. No one rushed to speak. No one filled the space for me. The silence held, steady and deliberate, like everyone understood that whatever came next had to be chosen, not assumed. I felt calm. Not the tight calm of restraint, but the quiet certainty that comes when you no longer need permission to exist in your own story. I wasn't bracing myself to explain. I wasn't preparing to defend anything. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and I knew I didn't need many words to say it. "I want to be clear about one thing," I said. Every eye stayed on me. "I didn't agree to decisions being made for me," I continued, "and I didn't ask anyone to speak on my behalf." That was it. No list of corrections, no timeline, no accusations, just a boundary, stated plainly, without emotion or apology. The effect was immediate. No one argued. No one challenged me. The room adjusted around that truth, the way it does when something finally makes sense. People nodded slowly. Someone wrote something down. Another person suggested revisiting a few points before moving forward. Things slowed. That was the real change. Decisions were no longer declared. They were discussed. Questions were asked instead of answered prematurely. Authority shifted, not dramatically but visibly, redistributing itself across the table. My sister didn't say anything. She sat very still, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. For weeks she had filled every pause with certainty. Now, she let the silence exist without trying to control it. She didn't look defeated, she looked exposed. Not because anyone had attacked her, but because the role she'd assumed no longer fit the room. The confidence she'd relied on had lost its audience. Without my silence to absorb and translate, her words carried less weight. That was the consequence. Not humiliation, not punishment, just loss of control. As the conversation continued, I spoke only when I needed to. Briefly, precisely. Each time, my words were taken at face value. No one reinterpreted them. No one softened them for comfort. I realized then how much energy I'd spent before trying to make myself understandable to people who had already decided who I was. That work was over. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic conclusion, no final judgment, just a mutual understanding that things would move differently from now on. And they did. In the days that followed, communication changed. People checked with me directly. Decisions were paused instead of assumed. When my sister spoke, it was as one voice among others, not the final authority. She didn't challenge me. She didn't apologize either. She didn't need to. The power she'd held had depended on a misunderstanding she never questioned. Once that misunderstanding dissolved, there was nothing left to argue about. I thought about that often afterward, about how easily silence is mistaken for confusion, how quickly people decide that the person who speaks the loudest understands the most, and how rarely anyone stops to ask why someone might choose not to engage. I didn't stop responding because I didn't understand. I stopped because explaining myself had become a liability, because every word I offered was being reshaped, repurposed, used to support a version of me that made things easier for everyone else. Silence wasn't retreat. It was refusal. Refusal to perform confusion. Refusal to be managed. Refusal to keep participating in a story that wasn't mine. Walking away from that room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt restored. There's a difference. Victory needs witnesses. Restoration doesn't. It happens quietly, internally, when you reclaim something you'd been taught to give away. For me, that something was my voice, not in the sense of speaking more, but in choosing when my words mattered. If you've ever been spoken for, decided for, labeled as confused or too much or not capable, I hope this sounds familiar. I hope you recognize the moment when silence stops being absence and starts being intention. And if you're still in that moment, still watching, still waiting, know this. You don't owe clarity to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. If this story felt close to home, you're not alone. Share your experience in the comments if you're comfortable. These stories matter, especially the quiet ones. And if you want to hear more like this, stories about reclaiming power without shouting, about justice that unfolds calmly, stay here with me. Subscribe, come back, and keep listening. Sometimes the strongest response isn't louder words. It's knowing when to stop explaining and letting the truth stand on its own.